Hello and welcome to People Making Money. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we are here every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, which I found out earlier today, at least this time of year, is the same time as it is in Phoenix, Arizona. So, or at least Scottsdale, where specifically I looked it up. And we talk about all things related to professional success and wealth building. So today I'm starting something that I'm going to make a monthly feature of the show, and that is talking about the state of the economy. So when we hear when we hear about things in the news related to inflation and unemployment and all those kind of things, almost always they're reported on a national basis, and that's all good and well. But as I pointed out in my shows earlier this week, sort of priming for today, none of us lives in the nation, in the sense that we live sort of this average life based on what happens in all 50 states. Rather, we live in our locality, whatever city or town we live in, and the way inflation, unemployment, wage growth, all those things work varies from location to location. So while people in Los Angeles may be experiencing one set of economic factors, people in Omaha, Nebraska very likely are experiencing different ones, especially during times like now where there's a fair amount of economic turmoil going on. So what I'm going to be doing now like I said, each month, it's going to be the second Wednesday of each month, I think. let me double check on that so I'm not giving you bad information. Let's see. Yes, the second Wednesday of each month. It will vary from that occasionally because there's a certain date that economic data is released. And so if the second Wednesday comes too early, it'll end up being the third Wednesday. But in any event, what I'm going to be doing each month is working through the data and showing you how experiences of different people in different parts of the country, why they're varying, how that may be impacting them. Now, as you know, I don't speak about politics on my shows. So this is not meant to be a political discourse. This is meant to be an informational opportunity for us to understand what's going on in our economic lives. And so I'm not going to be making, political remarks about, this elected official or this appointed official. Not in that sense. I may refer to, so for example, in the Wall Street Journal this morning, one of the headlines was that the Federal Reserve is likely going to hold off on lowering interest rates based on the consumer price index data that was released earlier this week. So that's not a political statement. That's just a statement of fact. I believe it was the chairman of the Fed who released that. That's what he decided to do. Now, his job, of course, is to provide guidance on what the Fed is likely to do going forward. Although the other members of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System also make statements. So, from time to time, we may talk about the statements they've made and how that might impact what's going to be happening in the future. But again, I'm not talking about those things from a political standpoint, merely from an informational one. So we're going to look at several economic indicators. And the first one we're going to cover each month is inflation. So and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So the consumer price index, which is the measure of inflation that's most often used here in the United States, is compiled and issued by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. which is part of the U.S. Department of Labor. Okay, so you can see here. Okay, here's a chart. This is a summary of what's gone on. So 12-month percentage changes, okay, in the consumer price index for selected categories as of last month. Okay, and that's what happens when a month ends. Then they compile the data for that previous month and they publish this information. So you can see that for all items, the consumer price index, all major categories, was up 3.5%, and that's what you heard, um, uh, broadcast in the media. Now, keep in mind, this is in essence an average across the entire United States. Now, food, okay, was up 2.2% year over year, and energy was up 2.1%. So if food and energy were up, basically a little over 2%, how is it that overall inflation was 3.5%? Well, that's because all items except for food and energy went up 3.8%. Now, why just looking at this, and again, this is national data, so it wouldn't necessarily mirror your experience, but right away you can see that, for example, if you don't drive a car, okay, and there's lots of people who don't drive a car. My friend Michael hasn't driven a car in years and years and years. Okay, so the lowering effect of energy only going up 2.1% for someone who doesn't drive a car doesn't impact the overall rate as much. And so they were likely, all other things being equal, to have experienced what is a higher rate of inflation. Okay, because you can explain this again. The fact that energy only went up by 2.1%, whereas all other items went up by 3.8%. So these somewhat average each other out. Now, if you take this out of the category altogether, that means these other items have a bigger impact on your overall experience of inflation, which means that it's your overall experience would likely be higher than 3.5%. Okay. Now, we're going to take a look at this here. So CPI for all items rose 0.4%. Well, how could that be? Well, this is a month over month increase. Okay. So from February of 2024, the consumer price index for all items went up 0.4%. Now, if you annualize that, you would come up with almost 5% for the year. Okay. So, and this is one of the reasons probably that the Federal Reserve has come out and said, well, we don't count on us lowering interest rates as soon as we might have been indicating earlier this year. Okay, because 5% is much too high. 4.8 would be the actual annualized figure. Okay, that would be much too high for the Federal Reserve to justify lowering lowering interest rates, I should say. Now, one of the things I want to note here is this CPI that's reported in the media is for all urban consumers. Okay, now urban consumers, and I'm going back into my body of knowledge, make up, I think, roughly 80% of Americans. But if you live in rural areas, okay, your experience is not taken into account in the consumer price index figure that is typically reported in the news. Okay, so you may be, in rural Wyoming, let's say, okay, and you may have felt like, wow, prices for me seem to have gone up much more than 3.5%. That could absolutely be the case, because this is not reflective of your experience at all. Now, I will say, by the way, it's hard to get inflation numbers for rural areas. Okay, you don't see them published as often. They're not published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, at least not on a regular basis. Okay, so, all right, so this is the national figure, which is what's typically reported in the media. Now, let's go to the regional picture. Okay, so you should be seeing, and just to make sure, let's go to, oops. Okay, okay. Here we go. I'm going to make sure. Okay, so you're now looking at the CPI information for the Los Angeles area for March of this year. Okay, notice that area prices were up 0.7% over the past month versus 0.4% nationwide. Okay, and up 4% from a year ago. So if you're living in Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim, California, which is the area covered by this particular version of the consumer price index. Again, it's all urban consumers, okay, but it's now we're talking about a region that's basically the Los Angeles area. Where this is where I live. We experienced inflation at a significantly higher rate than the nation as a whole. In fact, almost double, right? Because the nation as a whole experienced 0.4% month over month. We experienced 0.7% month over month. Okay, so, and you'll notice, by the way, that it is similar. All items less food and energy were higher than the all items index. Okay, so food and energy. Here you go. Let's look at the details here. Okay, so food prices actually declined 0.2% in the month of March. Okay, and prices for food away from home decreased 0.3%. Okay, on the other hand, energy here in Los Angeles, okay, went up 0.5%. Okay, and the price for electricity rose 2.1%. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the price for national. This is not for energy in total. The price of natural gas went up 0.5% in the period. Okay, and the increase of 3.3% was due mainly to higher prices for gasoline that went up 4.5%. Okay, from the prior year. These are annual figures. I'm sorry, no, these are monthly figures. Okay, so that's why it was so high. Okay, so although although food prices went down a little bit, energy prices went up quite a bit, especially gasoline and electricity, and that's why the CPI in Los Angeles went up much higher. Okay, now here we can look at this gives us the year by year trends. That we've experienced since 2020. So, and this is again just for the Los Angeles area. So, in 2020, prices went up 3.1%. In 2021, only 0.9%, but in 2022, they went up 0.7.5%. Now, this is the year over year figure. Okay, in 2023, 5.8% and 2.5%. These are all in January. Let's look at March and see how. So, as we said a moment ago, prices went up year over year in March by 4%. Last year, 3.7%, pretty similar. 2022 in March, prices went up 8.5%. Okay, so the inflation rate here in LA year over year for March has more than halved, okay? But it's still significantly higher than it was in 2020 and 2022 when it was half of what it is today. Okay? So if you live in the LA area like me and you feel like, wow, I'm still facing higher prices, that probably shouldn't surprise you, because although inflation isn't going up as much as it did in 2022, it's still going up faster than it has historically over the last whatever period, 2020 and probably back into the teens. Okay. And you'll notice something else. Let's look over here. So in August of last year, the rate was the monthly rate was 0.7%. Then it dropped to 0.3. Then prices actually dropped in October by 0.1%, and in November by 0.4%, and they were essentially unchanged in December. So the end of last year, starting in September, here in LA, it seemed like inflation was really getting under control. We were even experiencing a little bit of deflation. Okay. And then bang, here we are in January. Prices went up a full percentage point just in January. And that was followed by a 0.5 percentage point and then 0.7% here in March. So you can see it looks like inflation is heating up here in Los Angeles. Okay. So let's look at let's look at the CPI for Omaha, Nebraska. Okay, this is the Midwest Information Office. Okay, and Consumer Price Index, Midwest region. Okay, so here's the same information for the Midwest region. Okay, and let's see where I want to see if it shows us which states this covers. Mountain Plains, Midwest region. Okay, well, it certainly covers Nebraska. Okay, so notice that although prices were up in March 0.7%, also in the Midwest region, which is the same as here in LA, year over year, they are only up 2.8% versus 4. Okay. So the Midwest region, while it had a similar inflation rate this month, over the last year has experienced less inflation, about 1/3 less inflation than we have here in Los Angeles. Okay. Now, food prices, okay, were essentially the same. Okay. They went up. Food away from home went up 0.1%. Food prices at home went down by 0.1%. Basically, they were even. Okay. Energy prices rose 3.6% over the month, similar to here. Okay, look at this though. Gasoline went up almost 9%. Okay, but electricity was essentially unchanged, and prices for natural gas declined by over 5%. So you can see a much different picture with respect to energy costs than we had here in Los Angeles. So this is why the reason I'm pointing this out is it's, people in different parts of the country experience inflation very differently. So while the national number is all good and well, you're well advised to look up what really happened where I'm located. And you can just do a simple search, just like I did, CPI for the city or town you're living in, and it'll give you at least the regional data, which is going to be more specific to where you're living. Okay. Notice that for the last 4 months of last year, inflation, well, you had deflation 3 of the months, but I mean, essentially prices were unchanged. Okay. And then like in Los Angeles, they did bump up in January, but only by 0.3 versus a full percent. Okay. And, but the trend again, even, in Nebraska is they've been increasing this year. Okay. And again, that's what I suspect is saying to the Federal Reserve, we better hold off on interest rate increases. Okay, so that is inflation. Now let's look at what are called real earnings. Okay, this is is essentially wages. Okay, so let's look at this chart now. All right. So what you're seeing here, again, this is real earnings averaged across the entire country. Okay, so in March, real earnings, real average earnings per hour were $11.11. Okay, unchanged from February, but look, slightly down from January, and more importantly, perhaps up only 7 cents from March of 2023, the year before. And you see that here in the percentage change, right? They're showing essentially, well, there's no change February to March, 0%. Okay, there's a 0.5% change in between year over year. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, on the one hand, inflation nationally went up by what was the figure? 3.5%, but wages overall only went up by 0.5%. So it shouldn't be any surprise that people feel like prices are going up. They're feeling the pinch from inflation. Okay, let me give you a sort of a practical example. I had a meeting yesterday with a fellow who he's both a cultivator and a dispenser of cannabis. Okay, and so here in California, we have is what amounts to legalized growing and dispensing of marijuana. Okay, so his business, he told me, has fallen off significantly, whereas he would have perhaps 200 customers a day back in 2022. At this point, he gets maybe 60 customers a day, so less than a third of his former number of customers. So I asked him, why do you think your number of customers has dropped so much? And what he told me was people are really starting to feel the pinch of inflation. So after sort of dealing with it now for 2.5 years, they're really starting, and something like smoking pot is, I guess, a luxury. I don't know, never smoked it. I know a lot of people don't believe me when I say that, but I never have. So people just aren't buying it as much. And also there's been a huge increase in the supply of marijuana. So what he can sell his cannabis for is lower, and the number of people who want to buy it is lower. That all translates into less income for his business. Okay, and so and we can see here, at least on a national basis, why wages are up only nominally, whereas inflation, and here's let's see, I saw the CPI here. Where was it? Here it is. Okay, so the consumer price index was up 3.5%. We can see this right here. Okay, so now let's look at state by state information for. Oops, no, I clicked the wrong thing. Hang on one sec. Here we go. State by state real earnings. Okay, and we'll go back. Here we go. Okay, so this is personal income by state. Okay, this is also released by the federal government. Okay, so you see this chart here. Okay, personal income. I'm gonna go ahead and click on this. I think it enlarges. There you go. Okay, great. So let's look at this. So if you recall, in California, inflation, at least in the LA area, was 4%. Okay. Personal income percent change year over year, 3.4%. So, Californians, if we're looking at the national data, may think, well, what's going on here? How come we're still feeling the pinch? Well, the reality is, even though we had 3.4% growth in personal income, inflation was much higher at 4%, And so we're still losing ground. Okay. Now, look at Nebraska. Even worse. Nebraska had a 1.7% increase in personal income, whereas they experienced inflation. I don't remember the number now, but much higher rate, more than double that, as I recall. Right. So for people in the look at people in the Midwest. And by the way, you see this chart here, the lighter the color, the lower the increase in wages. So throughout the Midwest and into the South, okay, and even in the upper Midwest and into the Mid-Atlantic area, okay, in general, okay, um, personal income increases state by state were lower, in some cases significantly lower. Look at Iowa, only a 0.8% increase. Arkansas, 0.1% increase. Okay. North Dakota, 0.8%. Kansas, 2.2. Significantly lower than certainly the national CPI. And I bet if we looked at the regional CPI for these areas, we would see much lower than the regional CPI as well. So if you're living in the Midwest, it shouldn't be any surprise if you're feeling like, wow, things are not as good this year as they were last year, because you've lost a lot of ground in terms of real earnings versus prices. Now, the flip side is for the sort of mountain states, okay, where we see all these dark orange states, that they're in the top quintile, the top 20% of increases. So the lowest one here is 4.9%, Wyoming 5.5, Idaho 5.6, Nevada 6.7, Texas 5.2, Florida 5.6. Okay, Mississippi, good for Mississippi, right? 5.5. So for these states, people living there, okay, may be feeling like, why are people complaining about feeling so far behind? I feel pretty good about my finances. Well, the reason would appear to be that their personal income has increased faster than inflation. Okay. So for people in the middle quintile, the middle 20, 1/5, they're probably feeling like they're treading water. For the two lower quintiles, they're probably feeling they're losing ground. And for the upper two quintile, they're probably feeling like, I'm not losing any ground, and I may even be gaining. Okay. People in Nevada, unless inflation in Nevada is very, very high, it would appear that people in Nevada are doing quite well. Okay, so that's what, again, this is what we need to look at to really understand our own experience and to understand the experience of other people in the country. So if I'm talking to a friend of mine, in Florida, and he's like, I don't know, things seem pretty good to me, I'd be like, well, yeah, that makes sense, because the Florida economy overall is doing much better than the California economy. Okay, just on the numbers. Okay, and California is doing, it appears, a little bit better than New York, depending on how the inflation numbers, okay, fall out. So these are the kind of things to look at. Inflation is one side of the picture, but wage growth is the other. So if wages are growing faster than inflation, then people are more than keeping up. But if they're not, like here in the Midwest, especially the upper Midwest, then people are falling behind, and they feel it. Okay, next, let's look at unemployment. I'm going to close these out. Okay, here we go. Civilian unemployment. Okay, now, just like we've been doing all along, this is looking at the country as a whole. Okay, and we see here that the unemployment rate as of March is 3.8%. Okay, 3.8%. Now, that's higher. Well, it's been around that same figure since around August. July, we're going back. So as of March of last year, it was 3.5%. So the unemployment rate has come up a little bit since since March. However, it's of course since we'll say January 2022, it's about on par with January of 2022, about 4%. So all in all, employment has been relatively steady for the last 2.25 years. Okay. Employment unemployment peaked in at 14.8% in April of 2020. Okay, so 4 years ago, we were at almost 15% unemployment, obviously because of COVID. Now, right before COVID, by the way, we were pretty much at the same level we are now. Okay, and you can see that employment was trending down since 2009. That was the last peak at 10%. And overall, this time down, 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 down. Then we had this big spike because of COVID. Okay. And then by, let's see, yeah, by say November, December of 2021, it was back down to about 4%. Okay. So this was a temporary phenomenon. Really, it was a one, two, at most a 2-year phenomenon, and the super high was really just a 1-year phenomenon. Okay, now that's for the entire population. Now let's look at, this is the rate for men. Okay, so the rate for men typically is a little bit lower than the overall rate. Okay, looking at women. Okay, so let's take men off so we can see more easily. Okay, for women as well, that's interesting. For women as well, the overall unemployment rate is a little bit. This is for women 20 years and over. The rate is a little bit lower than the rate for the total rate. Okay, now let's look at teenagers. Okay, the rate for teenagers is much, much higher than it is overall. So teenage unemployment has been very, very high, and this is why we can see that for people 20 years and over, it's actually a little bit lower than the total. Okay, now look at the unemployment rate for whites. Okay, for whites, it's a little bit below the total. Okay, and for blacks, okay, much higher than the total. Okay, and then let's look at Asians. Okay, Asians, not much lower, but significantly lower than the total. Okay, and finally for Hispanics or Latinos, okay, a little bit higher. Okay, so by racial group, that's the data. Now again, this is for the country as a whole. Now let's look at the state by state unemployment rate. Okay, we'll go back here and unemployment rates for the states. Okay, so what do we have? So the lowest unemployment in the country is North Dakota at 0.2%. This is for February. Okay, evidently the March figures haven't been posted yet. And the highest is California at 5.3%. Okay, now if you recall, unemployment was 3.8%. Okay, so starting around let's see, Michigan and down 3.9%. Okay, that's still pretty much in there. Okay, not till you get to Oregon, West Virginia, do we see that it's about a 0.5 percentage point above the national average. Okay, now in the mountain states and in the Midwest, okay, the unemployment rate is significantly lower than it is for the country as a whole. Indeed, in some cases, it's half. Okay, Alabama, Virginia, Wisconsin, Florida, all in the 3% range. Okay, so And you can see, though, that because California is so big, well, let's look at it this way. So you'll notice that only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So only about a third of the states have an unemployment rate that's significantly higher than the national rate. The issue is that big states like New York and California have high unemployment rates. And so that raises the overall unemployment rate for the country higher than what most individual states are experiencing. Okay. So, again, this is an important thing to understand. If you're living in one of these higher unemployment areas, and you can see Washington State, Illinois, New Jersey, District of Columbia, Nevada, California, these are all, and Alaska, these are all in the almost 5 to over 5% range. Okay, you're experiencing unemployment differently, okay, than the country as a whole. The flip side is the job market remains very tight in the Dakotas and some of these other states. Okay, now, unemployment rates cannot be looked at separately from what are called workforce participation rates. So, workforce participation rates, um, when we calculate an unemployment rate, what we're calculating is the number of people who are not employed versus the number of people who are participating in the labor force. So, and there's a specific definition for that, but the reality is some people get discouraged and they drop out of the labor force. So, when someone drops out of the labor force, that can make it look like unemployment is going down, even though the number of people working hasn't changed. Okay, and the reason is because unemployment is factored as a percentage of the number of people who are in the labor force. Okay, now here's an interesting thing. Notice back here 20 years ago, the workforce, the civilian labor force participation rate was 66%. Okay, now here we are, March of this year, and the civilian labor force participation rate is under 63%. Okay, so we are not anything close to the labor force participation rate that we were back 20 years ago. And while we are up from, so you can see that at the depths of COVID, the labor force participation rate was down to 60%. So we have bounced back from there somewhat. Okay. Right before that, it was at 63.3%. So we're still not actually back, nor have we ever actually been back to the labor force participation rate that we had prior to COVID, which tends to indicate that as a result of COVID, okay, some people have left the labor force and they're not coming back. That would be the conclusion I would draw. Okay, so now let's look at again some of these segments. Okay, so men 20 years and older, should be no surprise. Their labor force participation rate is much higher than the total. Okay, and as shouldn't surprise us, women is lower because women stay home, raise children, etc. Okay, all right, let's take these out. Now let's look at teenagers. Okay, teenagers is also significantly lower, and that's part of the result of having a high unemployment rate. Is a lot of teenagers either give up or they don't want to have a job because they're focusing on school, etc. Okay, now we can look at racial groups. So whites, pretty much tracking. Okay, blacks have been lower prior to COVID. Since COVID, they've been bouncing back and forth, below and above. Okay, interesting trend. Asians, typically higher. Okay, shouldn't surprise. And then finally, Hispanics or Latinos, significantly higher. Okay, isn't that interesting? So, but still, you'll notice even for a group who's got a higher labor participation rate, they were at 67% just prior to COVID. Okay, well, I guess yeah, they're just about back. They're just oh no, I'm looking at the wrong thing. They were at about 68% prior to COVID, and then they're still below the prior to COVID numbers. Okay, now just like we did with unemployment, this is national, but we really need to look at more regional numbers. So the labor force participation rate regionally. Okay, here we go. So this is an interesting map, and want to make sure you can see this. Okay, so this is a county by county map of labor force participation. Okay, and you can see the lighter the color, the lower the participation rate. So there are some areas. Let me see if I can get this to. Oh, okay. I want to see if I can get this bigger. Oh, yeah. Here we wait. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So you can see there are some areas where the participation rate is, upwards of 95% in these really dark blue areas. So Sheraton County, Nebraska, 85% for women. Okay. I see the group. Let's look at total. Let's flip that over. Okay. We're going to look at total first. Okay. So let's see. Let's pick a thing here. Okay. Powder River County, Montana. Labor force participation rate, 86%. Okay, as opposed to Lassen County, California, where the rate is 40%. Okay, less than half. All right, let's and you notice in the upper Midwest, okay, that's where you see the most dark blue, and therefore the highest percentage of people regionally participating in the labor force. Whereas when you start getting into the Southwest, you see overall it's much lighter. Okay, here's Catron County, New Mexico, 45%. What is this? This is Lincoln County, Colorado, 37%. Fremont County, Colorado, 46.6. Bent County, Colorado, 35.8. Let's go over to here to some other ones. Let's see if we can find. Telfair County, Georgia, 45%. Some of these are probably fairly rural. So let's look at this now on a state by state basis. That's going to give us a little bit bigger picture. Okay, so you can see Minnesota has the highest labor force participation rate of any state at 81%. Oh, let's go back to total. Okay, actually, the upper Midwest has the highest of the country. Okay, you'll notice that New Mexico and the sort of western South, if you will, have the lowest labor force participation rates. Okay, and most of the country is kind of in the middle. Okay, so Florida is at 75.6, California 76.4, okay, pretty much the same. New York 77.3, Nevada 77.5, okay, so a lot of these are in the, sort of mid to high 70% rates. Okay, now let's look at the difference for men. Okay, now you'll notice the map gets significantly darker for men because men tend to participate in the labor force at a much higher percentage. And interestingly, for men, Nebraska has the highest labor force participation rate at 88.1%. Okay, and except for the South and Michigan and West Virginia, okay, most of the country is in the low 80s and above in terms of the male participation rate. Now, for women, okay, you see that the map is much lighter because, again, as we saw before, women tend to participate less for various reasons. Okay, in Texas, less than 70%. In Minnesota, this is the highest, 81%. Okay, and then, okay, so you can see that because of the difference in labor participation, that can have an impact on what the unemployment rate is. So for California, let's go back to total. Okay. So California, where the labor force participation rate is 76.4%, nonetheless, California has a 5.3% unemployment rate. Okay. Oops, that was weird. That's significantly higher than South Dakota, that not only has an 82.6% labor participation rate, but only a 2% unemployment rate. So the labor market in South Dakota is much, much tighter than it is in California when we look at these two factors together, which is what we need to do. So the likelihood of wage gains in South Dakota would seem to be higher because of the tightness of the market versus a place like California. Okay, now let's go on to look at a couple of other things. All right, we're going to look at job openings. Here we go. Okay, so where has employment changed? I'm sorry, we're not doing job openings. We're doing employment by industry. Where did we see job growth last month? This is important too. So you'll see that this is number of jobs, 20,000, 40, 60, 80, 100. Okay. Where did the most job growth come? In basically four areas. One is government. Okay. The largest job growth came in private education and health. The second largest came in government. The third largest came in leisure and hospitality, and the fourth in construction. Okay, so construction had an increase of 39,000 jobs. Leisure and hospitality, 16,900, about 17,000. Now, what that reflects is, even though it had wait, let me look at this again for a second. I'm sorry. There was not 39,000. I'm sorry. There was 8,000 new jobs in construction. Okay. There was about 17,000 in the leisure and hospitality. There was over 23,000 in government, and there was about over 26,000 in private education and healthcare. Now, notice that a lot of the growth, in fact, almost all the growth is in services. Okay. And a lot of the growth are in services that aren't particularly productive. So government doesn't produce anything. Okay. And really, private education and healthcare services don't either. Okay. So although there were big job gains in March, nonetheless, in productive areas like mining and logging, manufacturing, wholesale trade, retail trade, financial activities, professional and business services. And in those areas, there was almost no job growth, or there was negative in utilities, there were losses. But in manufacturing, there was zero job growth, it's saying here. Okay. And in wholesale trade, there was 8,500 jobs grew. Okay. So so you can see that while there was large job growth, 50,000 of it was healthcare and government. Okay. Now we can look at a 3-month period and we see pretty much the same trend. Okay. Over 3 months still, I've been reporting this wrong. I just realized. Okay. So there was an 88,000 job gain in education and healthcare, and there was a 71,000 gain in government. So 150, almost 160,000 jobs between the two of them. Okay. Now, in the last 3 months, there's been 270,000 jobs gained in private education and healthcare services, and there's been almost 200,000 jobs gained in government. So the real job growth, and looking at the 6 months, same thing, 12 months, okay, the real job growth, the real things that have been pushing job growth for the last 12 months, 1 million jobs gained in education and private education and healthcare, and 664,000 in government, okay? So you can see where job growth by industry is coming. There's been very little growth in manufacturing, 24,000 over a year, despite all of the information we've been seeing about wanting to reshore manufacturing and all that. Wholesale trade also not a whole lot, a 1% change. Retail trade, a 0.5% change. Okay, financial activities, less than a 1% change. Professional and business services, also less than a 1% change, versus private education and healthcare, over a 4% change, and government, which has had almost a 3% increase. Okay, and then hospitality and leisure, also about 3%, and construction, 3.4%. Okay, so this shows you what industries are growing in terms of employment. Now, let's look now at the state by state. Okay, state by state employment. Okay, and it's not going to let me do this. Okay, so right here, okay, we're looking at industry employment by state. Okay, so total non-farm employment in California, for example, is almost 18 million. In Texas, over 14. In Florida, almost 10. In Montana, a little over 500,000. Okay, much smaller workforces, not even 300,000 in Wyoming, etc. Okay, now let's look at some sectors. Let's look at construction. Okay, so construction in California, almost 1 million people, 900, over 900,000 work in construction. Okay, over 600,000 work in construction in Florida, and almost 850,000 in Texas, 23,000 in Wyoming, 31,000 in South Dakota, etc. So you can get an idea. Okay, now let's go to here we go, education and healthcare services. Okay, so California, 3.2 million in education and healthcare services, 1.9 million in Texas, 1.5 in Florida, less than 30. Less than 30. Is this, are these in millions? No. So 30,000 in Wyoming, 85,000 in Montana, about 78,000 in South Dakota. Okay. By the way, almost 1 million in Illinois. Okay, now let's look at government. Okay, in California, 2.6 million people work in government. Now, just to look at that, total non-farm in California is 18 million. So roughly 15% of Californians work in government. Okay, Texas, 2 million, a little over 2 million versus 14 million. So approximately 1/7 work in government in Texas. Okay, Florida, about 10 million, and how many work in government? Okay, 1.1, or about 11%. Actually, it's probably closer to 12. Okay, now let's look at a state like Wyoming. There's 70,000 in government versus 292 million overall. So you've got almost a quarter of the workforce in Wyoming working in government. Okay, so you can see how on a regional basis, if government employment is growing, it's maybe having more of an impact in a state like Wyoming than it does in California or Florida, where the percentage of people in government is lower. Okay, so that's employment by industry. Okay, state by state. And let's look at job openings. This is the last thing we're going to look at. All right. So these are job openings by industry nationwide. Okay, and the key thing to look at are change. No, this is a change month over month. So total month over month change in job openings from January to February, 0. Okay. That's and you can see if you come over here, you see essentially the same number of job openings. 8.75 million, 8.75 million. Actually, a few more in February, but statistically insignificant. Okay. So where are the changes in job openings? Where are things growing? First of all, let's look regionally. Okay. Regionally, job openings in the West are the only really significant change at 0.2%. So there's more job openings here in the West than there is in the other 4 parts of the country where there's 0, or they shrunk a little bit in the South. Okay. Now, where did job openings increase? Well, there was a 0.1% in almost a 1% increase in state and local government, excluding education. Okay, in terms of job openings. In the federal government, actually, job openings decreased by 0.7%. Okay. Arts and entertainment and recreation, job openings increased by 1.7%. Okay. Whereas for information, they decreased by 2.6%. So again, nationwide, this is telling you where are job openings increasing and where are they decreasing. Now, where they're increasing, there may be economic opportunity. Where they're decreasing, there may not be as much opportunity. This is, again, this is for the country as a whole. We really want to be looking at state by state. So here's a similar map to what we were looking for, only this time we're looking at job openings. So where are there the most job openings total in the country? Evidently, Alaska, Montana, Colorado, New Mexico, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Maryland. Okay. So the job opening rates there are 6.2% or above, versus the national rate, which is 5.3%. Okay. 5% and below, you see the states there that are now in yellow: California, Washington, Texas, Iowa, Michigan, New York, New Jersey. And that looks like, I think that's Connecticut right there, right? Connecticut. Yeah. Okay. So the middle quintile, these are the states that are basically on par with the nation as a whole. Okay. These are the ones that are higher, these two. And these are the ones that are slightly lower to lower. Okay. So, and let's just look at these. Okay. So California at 4.3%, significantly lower than the national average. Washington, 0.5% lower. Texas, 0.3% lower. Iowa, 0.4% lower. Michigan, okay. New York, New Jersey, 7.7% lower, and Connecticut. Okay, so California actually, in terms of job openings, has the lowest level in the country, it appears. Okay, versus the highest, looks like it's going to be Alaska. I think Alaska gets that award, right? There you go. So Alaska at 7.2, almost 2 percentage points higher than the rest of the country. So again, this gives you an indication of how tight the labor market may be, okay, and where there's opportunity. So if you're looking for opportunity in terms of more job openings, you want to be in the darker states, whereas in the lighter states, there are fewer job openings, which would generally mean that employers have a greater amount of leverage in negotiating than they would otherwise have. All right, so what does this all mean? Right, we've gone through a lot of statistics, okay, and it really comes down to, so there's the old saying, If I'm employed, there's no recession. And if I'm not employed, there is a recession, right? Economics, while we talk about it, even regionally, state by state or county by county, right? Economics is really an individual phenomenon. How we experience it is separate for each one of us. So it shouldn't be any surprise that we're not necessarily swayed when we hear, for example, that inflation is going up or unemployment is going up or down or whatever. Those don't necessarily affect us unless we're looking for a job. Okay, then unemployment may affect us. If the labor market is tight and we're looking for a job, it should be easier to get a job. Okay, so as we look at the various economic data out there, what I would encourage you to do is examine your own situation and think, what is going to be most impactful on me? So if you're working and you're making a good salary and you have prospects for increased income, so a lot of the job figures may not necessarily be particularly relevant to you. On the other hand, inflation numbers may be relevant as long as they're localized to where you're living. Because if you're going to go in and negotiate for a salary increase, for example, and inflation is 3.5% nationally, but you're here in California where it was 4%, it doesn't matter that inflation was a 0.5% lower across the country. What matters is here in LA, if this is where you're living, it went up by 4%. So for you to get a real pay increase, you need an increase of over 4%. Otherwise, you're just keeping pace with inflation. And that's a powerful argument. Now, by the way, you might say, well, wait, what if inflation is lower than the national average? Well, you can always go in and say, look, they've been reporting it in the media. Inflation is up 3.5%. So in order for me to gain any kind of ground, I need more than a 3.5% increase in pay. Now, if your employer, whoever you're negotiating with, isn't smart enough to say, well, wait a minute, but here in our locality, inflation was only 2.8%. So look, that's part of negotiating. And I'm not saying you should lie. But you want to know what the picture is, and then present it to your best advantage. Okay, so whatever numbers you want to know. Well, first of all, I'm going to be posting in the show notes all of these links that I was just using. So if you want to look at your economic situation, you'll be able to click through to all the different graphs and such, plots and maps that we were looking at, and you can take a look at your situation. And then if there's something specific, just do a quick Google search. Okay, so if you want, CPI for Columbus, Ohio, so just do CPI Columbus, Ohio, and it'll take you to the part of the Bureau of Labor Statistics website that has those numbers. Okay. And that'll allow you to do it doesn't take you very long. Okay. In putting together this chart with these numbers, it took me, I think, maybe 15, 20 minutes to put them together. It takes more time to explain it than it does to search the data out. But I would encourage you to take a look at this on a, periodically, so that you really understand where you're at economically, more so as an individual than as, this sort of amorphous, I live in the United States and here's what's going on. Well, so that's the show for today. Thank you very much for joining me. And this is also our last show for the week. So I want to wish you a wonderful rest of the day and a great rest of the week. Next week on Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, Trust and Estates Weekly. My guest is Paul DeLogary. I hope I'm saying that correct. And he's going to be talking about the 5 myths of probate debunked. I'm really looking forward to that because I'm not sure. I don't think I know what the 5 myths are. So that should be a fun show. Okay. And then on Tuesday at 10 a.m. is business lessons from the military. And then 7 days from today on Wednesday at 10 a.m. Is the next edition of People Making Money. So I hope you'll join us all 3 days next week. So again, thanks for being a part of the show today, and wishing you all the best, and signing off as I always do. Marie, you are my bell. All the best, folks.